The golden walls of Buckingham Palace seemed to press inward as Charles stood behind his mahogany desk, his fingers gripping a letter that had arrived that morning. The royal seal felt heavier than usual in his hands, and the words from Parliament echoed in his mind like thunder. Public opinion polls showed devastating numbers. The British people were losing faith not just in him, but in the very institution he was meant to protect. Camilla entered the throne room with her usual grace, her cream-colored dress flowing behind her as she approached. She had been his anchor through decades of turmoil, the woman who understood him when the world seemed to turn against them. But today, something was different in Charles's expression. The lines around his eyes had deepened overnight, and his shoulders carried a weight that seemed to bend his entire frame. "You asked to see me?" Camilla said softly, her voice carrying the warmth that had always calmed his restless spirit. She noticed immediately that he couldn't meet her gaze. His eyes fixed instead on the ancient tapestries that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. Charles turned away from her, walking toward the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. The autumn leaves were falling, creating a carpet of gold and crimson that reminded him of better times. His reflection in the glass showed a man torn between duty and desire, between the crown he wore and the heart that beat beneath it. "The advisors came to see me this morning," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Each word felt like a stone being placed on his chest. "The situation has become impossible." Camilla felt her breath catch in her throat. She had sensed the growing tension in recent weeks, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the worried glances exchanged between staff members, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. The throne room, with its centuries of history embedded in every stone, seemed to mock them both. Here kings had made decisions that shaped nations. Queens had stood strong in the face of invasion, and now Charles faced a choice that could either save or destroy everything his family had built. "What are they asking of you?" Camilla asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The media had been relentless, dredging up old scandals, questioning their marriage, suggesting that the monarchy needed a fresh start. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, until they became a roar that even the palace walls couldn't contain. Charles finally turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the same look he'd worn during their darkest days decades earlier. It was the expression of a man who knew he was about to lose everything that mattered to him, but who was powerless to stop it. "They want me to choose," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The crown or you." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, the weight of 800 years of royal tradition pressed down upon them both. Charles had waited his entire life to be king, had prepared for this role since childhood, had endured scandals and criticism all in service to the crown. But Camilla had been his companion through it all, the woman who had seen him not as a king or a prince but simply as Charles. Outside the windows, the world continued as normal. Tourists gathered at the palace gates, taking photographs and hoping for a glimpse of royalty. They had no idea that inside these walls, a drama was unfolding that would change the course of British history. The autumn wind rattled the ancient glass as if the palace itself was trembling at what was to come. Camilla sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The ornate furniture that had once seemed so grand now felt like a prison, trapping her in a moment she had always feared would come. Her hands trembled as she reached for the armrests, seeking something solid to anchor herself to reality. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. Years of navigating royal protocol had taught her to maintain composure, even when her world was crumbling. But Charles could see through the mask she wore so skillfully. Charles moved closer, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture that broke every rule of royal etiquette. In that moment, he wasn't a king seeking to comfort his queen consort. He was simply a man facing the impossible choice between love and duty. His hands covered hers, and she felt the tremor in his fingers that matched her own. "They've given me until the end of the week," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "The Prime Minister made it clear that if I don't act, Parliament will. There's talk of abdication proceedings." The word hung in the air like a curse. Abdication. The same path his great-uncle Edward had taken when he chose love over the crown. But Edward had been young, without decades of preparation, without the deep understanding of what the monarchy meant to Britain and the Commonwealth. Charles had spent 70 years preparing for this role, and now he was being asked to throw it all away or sacrifice the woman who had stood by him through everything. Camilla closed her eyes, remembering their wedding day just years earlier. The joy on Charles's face, the sense that finally, after so much struggle, they could be together openly. The British people had gradually accepted her, polls showed growing support, and she had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had won their battle against public opinion. What changed? She whispered. The numbers were improving. People were starting to understand. Charles's jaw tightened. The documentary, he said simply. Those two words carried the weight of their undoing. An investigative program had aired the previous month, rehashing old wounds, bringing forward new voices, painting their love story as a calculated manipulation of the royal family and the British public. It didn't matter that much of it was speculation and half-truths. The damage was swift and devastating. The throne room's ancient clock chimed the hour, each note reverberating through the vast space. Time was moving forward, carrying them toward a decision that would reshape not just their lives but the future of the monarchy itself. Charles could feel the weight of centuries of royal duty pressing down on him, while Camilla felt the familiar sting of being cast as the villain in a story she had never wanted to be part of. I won't let you give up the crown for me, Camilla said suddenly, her voice finding strength she didn't know she possessed. Not after everything you've sacrificed to get here. Your people need you, Charles. Britain needs you. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Even in her darkest hour, she was thinking of his duty, of the greater good. It was one of the many reasons he had fallen in love with her decades ago, and why that love had endured through scandal, separation, and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. And what about what I need? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. What about what we built together? You're not just my wife, Camilla. You're my partner, my advisor, my closest friend. Without you, without me, you'll be the king you were always meant to be, she interrupted, though the words felt like glass in her throat. And I'll find a way to support you from wherever I am. The reality of their situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The political pressure wasn't going to disappear overnight. The media circus would only intensify, and somewhere in the distance, they could both hear the faint sound of protesters gathering outside the palace gates, their chants growing louder as word of the crisis began to spread. The massive doors of the throne room burst open with a force that made both Charles and Camilla turn in alarm. William strode in, his face flushed with anger and determination. Behind him, palace staff hovered uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The future king's presence filled the room with a different kind of tension, one that spoke of family loyalty and royal succession. Father, we need to talk, William said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command respect from birth. His eyes moved between Charles and Camilla, taking in their strained expressions and the intimate way they sat together. In that moment, he looked every inch the future monarch he was destined to become. Charles rose slowly, his body language shifting from husband to father, from man to king. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, shoulders straightening, expression hardening, the weight of his position settling around him like a cloak. William, this isn't the time, Charles began, but his son cut him off with a gesture that was purely royal in its dismissal. This is exactly the time, William replied. The palace is in chaos. The staff don't know what to tell the press. Harry called from California asking if the rumors are true. And Catherine is fielding calls from world leaders who want to know if Britain is about to have another constitutional crisis. The mention of the wider family brought a new dimension to their private agony. This wasn't just about Charles and Camilla anymore. It was about William and Catherine, about Harry and his children, about the future of the monarchy itself. Every decision made in this room would ripple outward, affecting not just the royal family but the entire Commonwealth. Camilla stood quietly, understanding that her presence in this conversation between father and son was both necessary and painful. She had always been acutely aware of her position as the woman who had complicated the royal succession, who had caused division within the family she now belonged to. The advisors are calling for an emergency meeting, William continued, his voice softer now but no less urgent. They want to present options. But I needed to speak with you first, both of you, before any more decisions are made without consultation. Charles looked at his eldest son with a mixture of pride and anguish. William had grown into the role of future king with a grace and wisdom that sometimes surprised even his father. But seeing him now, forced into this position of having to guide the family through another crisis, Charles felt the full weight of what his personal choices had cost them all. "What would you have me do?" Charles asked, and for the first time in years, he sounded less like a king and more like a father seeking guidance from his child. William moved to the center of the room, positioning himself between the throne and where his father and stepmother stood. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. He was literally standing between the crown and their marriage, representing the impossible choice they all faced. "I would have you remember that the crown doesn't belong to any one person," William said carefully. "It belongs to the British people, to history, to the future. But I would also have you remember that kings have made difficult choices before and survived them." The diplomatic nature of his response revealed the careful training he had received in royal protocol, but Camilla could hear something else in his voice, a genuine concern for his father's happiness, complicated by his duty to protect the institution they all served. "The protesters outside aren't just angry about your marriage," William continued, his gaze moving to include Camilla in his words. "They're afraid of change, afraid of instability, afraid that the monarchy they've always known is disappearing. But fear isn't permanent. Public opinion can shift." Charles walked to his desk and picked up the morning's newspapers, their headlines screaming for his attention. Each one told a different version of the same story, but all of them painted Camilla as the woman who was destroying the monarchy from within. "And if it doesn't shift?" Charles asked. "If we wait and the situation only gets worse? What then, William? Do I watch the institution our family has served for 1,000 years crumble because I couldn't make the hard choice?" The question hung heavy in the air, carrying with it the weight of 8 centuries of royal tradition, the hopes of millions of people across the Commonwealth, and the personal cost of a decision that no parent should have to make in front of their child. The silence stretched between them until it was broken by the soft clearing of a throat. All three turned to see the Archbishop of Canterbury standing in the doorway, his presence adding yet another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Behind him stood the Prime Minister, her face grave with the weight of political necessity. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had counseled kings and commoners alike. "We apologize for the intrusion, but the situation requires immediate attention." Charles felt the walls of the throne room closing in around him. What had begun as a private moment with his wife had now become a council of war, with representatives of church and state gathering to determine the fate of his marriage and his reign. The Prime Minister stepped forward, her briefcase clutched tightly in her hands. "The emergency session of Parliament has been called for tomorrow morning," she announced without preamble. "There will be a vote of confidence. The opposition is prepared to move for abdication proceedings if the matter isn't resolved." Camilla felt the blood drain from her face. The political machinery was already in motion, grinding forward with the inexorable force of constitutional crisis. In less than 24 hours, the elected representatives of the British people would decide whether Charles could remain king while married to her. "What are you asking of us?" William interjected, his protective instincts toward both his father and the institution he would inherit, driving him to take control of the conversation. The Archbishop moved closer, his robes rustling softly in the vast space. "The Church has always supported the sanctity of marriage," he began carefully. "But we must also consider the role of the Crown as defender of the faith and the head of the Church of England. The bishops are divided." The careful diplomatic language couldn't hide the brutal reality. Even the Church that had married Charles and Camilla was now questioning whether their union was compatible with his role as king. Charles moved to stand beside Camilla, taking her hand in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. "Speak plainly," he commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. "What exactly are you all asking me to do?" The Prime Minister exchanged a glance with the Archbishop before opening her briefcase and removing a folder. "We've prepared several options for your consideration," she said, her voice clinically professional. "Temporary separation while public opinion settles. A more permanent arrangement where the Queen Consort steps back from all official duties, or what?" Camilla asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Or a complete severance of the marriage," the Archbishop finished quietly. an annulment on grounds that could preserve both your dignities while allowing His Majesty to remain on the throne. The word annulment hit Camilla like a physical blow. It would mean that their marriage had never legally existed, that the love they had fought so hard to legitimize would be erased from official history. It would make her not just a divorced queen, but a woman who had never been queen at all. William stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "That's absolutely out of the question," he said firmly. "My father and Camilla were legally married in the church. You cannot simply erase that because it's politically convenient." But Charles was staring at the folder in the Prime Minister's hands, understanding that inside it lay carefully drafted documents that would reshape not just his life, but British history itself. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The Parliament meets at 10 tomorrow morning," the Prime Minister replied. "But, Your Majesty, you should know that delaying the decision will only make the situation worse. The longer this crisis continues, the more damage it does to the monarchy's standing, both here and in the Commonwealth realms." Camilla squeezed Charles's hand, drawing strength from the contact even as she felt her world crumbling around her. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was weighing their personal happiness against the stability of the institution he had sworn to serve. The throne room, which had witnessed so many royal ceremonies and celebrations, now felt like a courtroom where their love was on trial, and the jury was an entire nation watching and waiting for their king to choose between his heart and his crown. As the officials filed out of the throne room, leaving Charles, Camilla, and William alone once more, the silence felt different, heavier, more final. The weight of political reality had settled over them all like a suffocating blanket. Charles moved to the window again, watching as protesters continued to gather in the distance, their signs and banners barely visible but their message unmistakably clear. "I need some air," Camilla said suddenly, her voice strained. She walked toward the private garden's entrance, needing space to process everything that had just unfolded. The carefully maintained roses that she had always loved seemed to mock her now with their perfect beauty, untouched by the chaos consuming her life. William approached his father, his expression softer now that they were alone. "Father, there might be another way," he said quietly. "Public opinion has shifted before. Remember how they felt about you after Diana's death and how that changed over time." Charles turned from the window, his eyes showing both hope and exhaustion. "That took years, William. Years of careful rebuilding, of proving myself worthy of their trust again. Do we have years? Does the monarchy have years to weather this storm?" The question revealed the heart of Charles's dilemma. At his age, every year mattered. He had waited longer than any heir in British history to become king, and now he was being asked to choose between the woman he loved and the role he had prepared for his entire life. Outside in the garden, Camilla found herself walking the same paths she and Charles had strolled countless times, planning their future together, discussing the changes they hoped to bring to the monarchy. Those conversations felt like they had happened in another lifetime, to different people who still believed that love could conquer all obstacles. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, each one trying to offer support or seeking information about what was really happening. But how could she explain that she was watching her husband choose between her and his duty? How could she put into words the feeling of being the person everyone blamed for a crisis she had never wanted to create? Back in the throne room, William was pacing now, his mind working through possibilities and scenarios. "What if we took a different approach?" he suggested. "What if instead of retreating we went on the offensive? A series of public appearances, interviews showing the people who you and Camilla really are together?" Charles shook his head slowly. The advisors suggested that weeks ago. But every public appearance now just gives the media more ammunition. Every smile is seen as arrogance. Every gesture of affection is flaunting our relationship in the face of public disapproval. The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. Charles and Camilla's genuine love for each other, which had sustained them through decades of scandal and separation, was now being used as evidence against them. Their happiness had become a political liability. When Camilla returned to the throne room, her face was composed, but her eyes showed the strain of her internal battle. She had made a decision in the garden, one that she knew would break both their hearts but might save everything else they held dear. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "about what the Prime Minister said, about temporary separation." Both Charles and William turned to look at her, recognizing the tone of someone who had come to a difficult conclusion. "Camilla, no," Charles said immediately. "We're not going back to hiding, to pretending we don't mean everything to each other. We fought too hard to get here." But Camilla stepped closer to him, reaching up to touch his face with infinite gentleness. "Sometimes fighting means knowing when to step back," she said softly. "Not forever. Just until the storm passes." William watched this exchange with growing understanding. Camilla wasn't giving up. She was making a strategic retreat, sacrificing her own happiness to protect the institution they all served. "It wouldn't have to be forever," she continued, though the words clearly caused her pain. "Just long enough for things to settle down. For people to see that you can be the king they need without me by your side officially." Charles gripped her hands tighter. "And what kind of king would I be, abandoning the woman I love the moment things get difficult? What message does that send about loyalty, about commitment?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the impossible nature of their situation. Every choice carried a cost. Every decision would be judged by history. And there seemed to be no path forward that didn't require enormous sacrifice from someone. The evening descended over Buckingham Palace like a heavy curtain, bringing with it the weight of the decision that could no longer be delayed. Charles had dismissed the staff, asking for complete privacy as he and Camilla spent what might be their last night together as husband and wife, at least in the public eye. They sat in their private sitting room, away from the formal grandeur of the staterooms, surrounded by personal photographs and mementos that told the story of their life together. The fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that felt both precious and heartbreaking. "Do you remember when we talked about growing old together?" Camilla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was looking at a photograph of them from their wedding day, their faces radiant with the joy of finally being able to love each other openly. Charles followed her gaze to the photograph. "I remember everything," he said. "I remember thinking that we had finally won, that we had outlasted all the opposition and earned the right to be happy together." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken words and shared memories. They had been through so much together. The scandal of their affair, the years of separation, the death of Diana, the gradual acceptance by his children and the public. Each challenge had made their bond stronger, but this one felt different. This one might be insurmountable. "The arrangements are already being made," Camilla said quietly. "My staff received calls this afternoon. They're preparing Ray Mill House for my return." Ray Mill House, her private residence that she had maintained even after becoming queen consort, almost as if she had always known she might need somewhere to retreat to. The mention of it made their separation suddenly, brutally real. Charles stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the courtyard. Even this late at night, he could see the glow of media cameras beyond the palace gates, waiting for any sign of movement, any hint of what decision had been made. "I could abdicate," he said suddenly, the words surprising even him. "Give William the crown, step away from all of it. We could have a quiet life together, away from all this madness." Camilla was beside him in an instant, her hands on his shoulders, turning him to face her. "Charles, no. You cannot even think such a thing. The country needs you. William isn't ready, not yet. And your mother, she spent 70 years preparing you for this moment. You cannot throw that away." Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, but Charles could see the tears she was trying so hard not to shed. She was being stronger than he was, more willing to sacrifice everything for duty and honor. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "How do we live with this decision?" Camilla moved closer, close enough that he could smell her familiar perfume, could feel the warmth of her presence that had comforted him through so many difficult times. "We do what we've always done," she said. "We survive, we endure, and we trust that someday, somehow, there will be a path back to each other." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the beginning of the day when Charles would have to face Parliament, the press and the world with his decision. They held each other in the darkness, neither wanting to be the first to say goodbye. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the palace stirring to life, staff preparing for what would undoubtedly be one of the most scrutinized days in recent royal history. Press statements would need to be drafted, security arrangements made, and the delicate machinery of constitutional monarchy adjusted to accommodate yet another crisis. "Promise me something," Camilla whispered into the quiet of their private sanctuary. Promise me that you'll be the king I know you can be. Don't let this break you. Don't let them see you as weak. Charles pulled back to look at her face in the firelight, memorizing every detail as if he might not see her again for a very long time. And promise me that you won't disappear completely, that you'll wait for me, for us, until we can find a way through this. They made their promises in the darkness. Two people who had loved each other through scandal and separation, through public hatred and private joy, now preparing to face their greatest test yet. Outside, the world waited for their decision, but in that moment they belonged only to each other and to the hope that love might somehow, someday, conquer even the weight of the crown. The morning came too soon, bringing with it the harsh reality of public duty and private heartbreak. Charles stood at the same window where he had wrestled with his impossible choice, now dressed in the formal attire that marked him unmistakably as king. The protesters had grown in number overnight, but their chants seemed somehow more distant now, as if the decision he had made had created a barrier between him and their anger. Camilla's departure had been arranged with the discretion that royal scandals demanded. No dramatic scenes at the front gates, no tearful goodbyes witnessed by the waiting cameras. Instead, she had slipped away through the private entrance, her simple black car disappearing into London traffic like any other vehicle carrying someone to an uncertain future. William stood beside his father now, offering silent support as Charles prepared for the most difficult speech of his reign. The throne room had been transformed into an impromptu press center, with cameras and microphones arranged to capture every word, every expression, every hint of emotion that might reveal the true cost of the decision he had made. The statement is ready, the press secretary announced quietly. Parliament is waiting and the Commonwealth leaders have been briefed on the situation. Charles nodded, understanding that the moment of privacy, of personal grief, was over. From this point forward, every word would be analyzed, every gesture interpreted, every pause scrutinized for meaning. He was no longer simply a man who had lost his wife. He was a king who had chosen his crown. As he walked toward the podium, Charles caught sight of his reflection in one of the ancient mirrors that lined the throne room walls. The man looking back at him seemed older somehow, marked by the weight of a decision that would define the remainder of his reign. But there was also something else in his reflection, a steely determination that hadn't been there the day before. The cameras began to roll, and Charles looked directly into the lens that would carry his words to millions of people around the world. His voice when he spoke was steady and clear, betraying none of the anguish that had consumed him just hours earlier. "My people," he began, "the strength of our monarchy has always rested on its ability to put duty before personal desire, service before self-interest. Today I reaffirm that commitment." He spoke of tradition and responsibility, of the sacred trust between the crown and the people it served. He acknowledged the concerns that had been raised and the difficult position in which recent events had placed the institution he led. But he did not mention Camilla by name, did not speak of love or loss or the personal cost of the decision he had made. When the cameras stopped rolling and the press filed out, William remained behind with his father. The throne room felt different now, larger somehow, more formal, as if Camilla's absence had stripped away some essential warmth that had made it feel like home. "How do you feel?" William asked, his voice gentle with concern. Charles was quiet for a long moment, looking around the room where just days earlier, he had held his wife's hand and promised her that they would find a way through their crisis together. Now she was gone, and he was left alone with the crown that had cost him everything else he had ever truly wanted. "I feel like a king," he said finally, and there was no triumph in his voice, only the heavy acceptance of duty fulfilled at enormous personal cost. In the distance, the sound of the protesters was finally fading as news of Camilla's departure spread. The immediate crisis was over. The constitutional monarchy was stable once again, and Charles remained on the throne his mother had prepared him to occupy his entire life. But in the quiet moments that followed, when the palace returned to its normal rhythms and the world moved on to other concerns, Charles found himself staring at the empty chair where Camilla had sat just days before. The throne room had witnessed many royal sacrifices over the centuries, but perhaps none as personal or as painful as the one it had just demanded of its latest king. The crown remained secure, duty had triumphed over desire, and the monarchy would continue as it had for nearly 1,000 years. But Charles knew that he would spend every remaining day of his reign wondering if there had been another way, another choice that might have saved both his crown and his heart. The throne room held its secrets as it always had, but this time the secret it kept was the true cost of being king.